Many patterns start with a square, then you cut it in half diagonally. Anytime a pattern tells you to do this, keep in mind you can always layer the two strips right away before you cut the squares and then cut them into triangles. So let me just sew one for you. I hold the thread tails and then put the part of the fabric that's a 1/4 inch away from the edge up to the needle. I hold the thread tails so they don't get sucked into the feed dogs, and tangle the points of my triangle. Then stitch. A lot of times I like to work at least in twos so I don't have to trim the threads. Okay. And I just finger press, and there's the way you can stitch two triangles together to make your half square. Instead of feeding two triangles through the sewing machine, you can also draw a diagonal line and stitch a 1/4 inch away from that line. And remember, you can pin. I'm just following the line with my 1/4 inch foot to the outside. Then you would cut on the line and you'll have two bias squares. Another way to do it is to use a 1/2 inch ruler. This one is a Quilter's Magic Wand. It has a laser cut line right down the center, which you line up with both points. Draw your stitching line, and then instead of stitching directly on the line, I stitch towards the center. I stitch within the line and use those lines for your stitching lines. I will say again, the pencil mark takes up some space, so sew on the inside towards the middle of your drawn line, and that will be more true to your measure than on the line. It also gives you room to fold over your triangle for the seam allowance. Lift up your presser foot to allow the threads to loosen so you can pull. Lifting your presser foot releases the tension discs so you can pull the thread, and then you just pivot and sew down the other side. Remember, I'm sewing just on the inside of that line. Then here you will cut down the center and you will have your two bias squares, or half square triangles. Line up your diagonal on the lines. Oh, this makes me think too that there are two different sizes of these Quilter's Magic Wand, so I made sure to get the largest one I could find at the time. You might want to consider that depending what size you like working with, what size squares. So you draw two diagonal lines. I know that's a little bit hard to see, but you will draw those lines. And then I will stitch, staying within my drawn lines because, you know, the pencil takes up some room. So you probably want to stay on the inside of the line rather than right on the line or outside, because that will cut down the size of your finished product. It's done exactly the same way as what I just did. You can pin. I had also pressed these squares together. Pressing helps them stick, also helps them grip each other. Once again, sew just on the inside of your drawn line. I also help push the top layer of fabric a little bit because my presser foot kind of pushes that top layer of fabric, so I just help edge it along. Do the same thing, sew off the edge, lift the presser foot to release the threads. You can pull a little bit to get the threads there. And then start sewing again. I want to just show you, it made a funny sound when I pivoted. I didn't have a full grasp of the feed dog, so I did have a little bit of mess on the bottom. So when I ended, I fed 2 squares through, and that's my leader. I just sew another project on the side, so I have a bunch of 1.5 inch squares cut. Then I stitch them together, and I just have a project in mind where I'm going to make 4 patches. So that's what I fed through as my leader for the next time I stitch. That will help keep my threads from getting sucked in underneath. So then I just start stitching right away, and then I don't have a problem. At the end of my stitching line, I'm just going to show you, I just feed my 2 little 1.5 inch squares through. So that was my ender for the stitch. Now it turns into a leader. See, nothing, no sound, nothing sucked it into the bottom. Just to be transparent here, it does help if you pin. You can see a little bit of white sticking out the sides, but when making this method, there is a little bit of room to trim down, so it should all come out fine in the end. With the 8 at a time method, there was an option to draw your grid first, halfway between the vertical and horizontal, and then you'd stitch your diagonals. You don't have to necessarily draw your grid because you'll intersect your stitching lines on the diagonal. That'll be the middle, and I'm also looking at the 4 inch line because remember I'm starting with 2 8 inch squares, so I know I'm already going to slice on that grid. So just check your multiple references, and with the camera in the way, I might not be lining it up as well as I normally stitch. And then if you do that goof, like I should have cut the diagonal first, you can cut through the diagonal of each quarter of this, or you can leave it together and cut between the stitching lines on the diagonal all the way across. And then you have your 8 triangles. Let me fold one over for you. I set the seam and then press open. I'll show you how to trim. You should make sure to have a square ruler, but you can match your point here. We're going to be cutting it so it trims up to 3.5. Line up the diagonal on the bias. And remember, if you didn't hear me say it before, trim the side with the feed dogs first. If you go this way, you'll have to go through the extra layers of the feed dog. And it might be pretty close to square where all you have to do is take a scissor and snip off the feed dog, and you might be satisfied with the rest. All right, and then you have your 3.5 inch or 3 inch finished 8 at a time bias squares or half square triangles.